My Aunt Vivian waited until the lawyer had finished reading the third page of my grandmother's will before she stood up in that oak-paneled office, smoothed the front of her charcoal dress, and told everyone in the room that there was something they all needed to hear before this went any further. Because it would be a crime against my grandmother's memory to let a thief inherit a single dollar of her estate. There were 9 of us seated in that room, my 2 cousins, my Uncle Ray, a few of my grandmother's oldest friends, the family lawyer Mr. Okonkwo behind his wide desk, and me, Nora Whitman, sitting in the corner chair I'd chosen specifically because it was farthest from Vivian. And Vivian turned to face all of them, with the practiced poise of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. She said that over the past year, while she had been the one managing my grandmother's accounts in her care, she had discovered that nearly $60,000 had gone missing from the household funds, and that the withdrawals traced back to the months when I had been staying at the house to help, and that she had the bank records to prove it. She said my name the way you'd handle something dirty, holding it at a distance. She said she hadn't wanted to believe it, that it broke her heart, but that my grandmother had trusted me, and I had repaid that trust by stealing from a dying woman, and that she would not stay silent while I collected an inheritance funded by the very money I'd taken. My Uncle Ray made a low sound like he'd been struck. One of my cousins, Marcus, actually pulled his chair back from mine, the leg scraping loud against the hardwood floor. And I sat there, holding the cup of lukewarm coffee Mr. Okonkwo's assistant had given me, and watched every face in that room rearrange itself into a version that had already decided I was guilty. Vivian did not stop there. She reached into a leather portfolio she'd brought and pulled out a thin stack of paper, holding it up so the room could see the columns of numbers, and she said she had the bank records right here, that she'd gone through them line by line because she owed my grandmother that much, and that the dates of the withdrawals lined up exactly with the weeks I'd stayed at the house. She let that sit, and then she added, in a voice gone soft, with what sounded like genuine grief, that the hardest part was that my grandmother had loved me, had spoken of me warmly right up to the end, and that she couldn't bear the thought of that trusting old woman learning what I'd done. Mr. Okonkwo tried to intervene, saying that this was a will reading and not the appropriate forum for accusations, that if there were concerns they should be raised through proper channels. But Vivian talked over him, saying proper channels were exactly how thieves got away with it, that she'd stayed quiet through proper channels for weeks and watched nothing happen, and that she would be damned if she'd sit in this room and watch me sign for an inheritance, while my grandmother's stolen money was still warm in my pockets. My aunt's oldest friend in the room, a woman named Delia I'd known since childhood, opened her mouth as if to say something, and then closed it again. And I noticed that, filed it away without understanding it, the way you notice a single detail in a moment that is otherwise coming apart around you. Vivian had controlled the family's money for as long as I could remember, ever since my grandfather died, and left my grandmother comfortable but unwilling to deal with the details. And Vivian had stepped into that role with an appetite that everyone mistook for generosity for the better part of 2 decades. What none of them saw, because Vivian was careful about who saw what, was the way she'd slowly made herself the only person who understood where anything was, the only signature on the accounts, the only one who spoke to the accountant, the only one who knew which investments existed and which had quietly been moved. I remember the year my mother, Vivian's younger sister, tried to ask a simple question about a trust that was supposed to fund my cousin's education, And Vivian answered with such wounded fury, such a performance of being doubted after all she sacrificed, that my mother apologized and never asked again. I remember, 4 years before that will reading, when my grandmother first started to slip, how Vivian volunteered to move into the house to provide care, and how grateful everyone was, and how quickly the locks on my grandmother's study were changed afterward. I remember visiting one afternoon and finding my grandmother confused about why she couldn't reach her old friend Delia on the phone, and Vivian explaining smoothly that Delia had grown difficult, and it was better for everyone if she screened those calls now. And I remember the look my grandmother gave me, a look I only understood much later, a look that was trying to tell me something she no longer had the words for. Vivian had spent 2 decades making herself indispensable. And the thing about making yourself the only person who knows where the money is that it also makes you the only person who could possibly move it somewhere else. I remember the Christmas she gave everyone in the family the same gift, an envelope of cash she described as coming from grandmother's generosity, and how everyone thanked grandmother, and how grandmother looked faintly puzzled by the thanks, and how I'd assumed at the time she was simply getting forgetful. I remember the summer my cousin needed help with a medical bill and went to Vivian instead of grandmother, because Vivian had made herself the door everything had to pass through, and how Vivian made him feel the help so keenly, reminded him of it so often, that he stopped asking for anything at all. I remember the accountant who'd handled the family's money for years, a kind older man named Frank, being replaced without explanation with someone new who only ever spoke to Vivian, and how when my mother asked what happened to Frank, Vivian said only that it had been time for a change, in a tone that closed the subject. And I remember, most of all, the afternoon 2 years before grandmother died, when I found her sitting alone in her study, with an old checkbook open in front of her, trying to add up figures in a shaking hand. And when I asked what she was doing, she said she was trying to understand her own money and couldn't. That every time she asked Vivian, she got a headache from the answers. And she looked at me and said, "Nora, promise me you'll remember I asked." And I promised without understanding what I was promising. And it would be years before I understood that she had been trying, even then, to leave a witness. What Vivian did not know, what nobody in that room knew except my literary agent and an accountant in another city, was that 3 years earlier, I had written a novel, quietly, in the evenings after long days at a job I hated. A novel I published under a pen name because I was terrified of it failing in front of people who already thought I'd amounted to nothing. And that novel had, over the previous 18 months, become the kind of success that changes a person's entire life. It had sold well over 1 million copies. It had been optioned for a series by a studio whose name everyone in that room would have recognized, under the name Elena Frost, a name I chose because it sounded like someone braver than me. I had earned more money in the past year and a half than Vivian had allegedly accused me of stealing, many times over. And I had told absolutely no one in my family, partly out of the old fear, and partly because I had learned, watching Vivian operate for 20 years, that the moment money becomes visible in a family like mine, it becomes something to be fought over, controlled, resented. I did not need my grandmother's inheritance. I had come to that will, reading not for the money, but because my grandmother had asked me to be there, in a letter she wrote during one of her last clear weeks, a letter I had folded in my coat pocket that very morning without understanding yet how much it would come to matter. Vivian had built her entire accusation on the assumption that I was the same broke, overlooked niece she'd watched flounder for years. A person who would need that inheritance so badly she'd have no choice but to fight dirty or slink away. She had no idea she was accusing a woman who could have bought the house outright and never noticed the dent. I remember the day my agent called to tell me the book had crossed 1 million copies, standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store with the phone against my ear, and how the first thing I felt was not joy, but a strange loneliness, because there was no one in my family I could tell, no one who wouldn't immediately turn the news into a question of what it meant for them. I remember signing the studio contract in a lawyer's office 1,000 miles from home, using my real name on the legal documents and Elena Frost on everything public, and the lawyer asking me why I kept the two so carefully separate, and me not having a clean answer beyond a feeling I'd carried since childhood that anything good I had would be taken or spoiled the moment it was seen. I had grown up in a family where Vivian decided what everyone deserved, and some part of me had built an entire secret life precisely so that there would be one thing, at least one thing, that Vivian's hands could never reach. The irony that this secret was now the very thing that made me untouchable, that made her accusation almost comic in its wrongness, was not lost on me as I sat in that will reading being called a thief by a woman who had no idea she was the poorest person in the room compared to the niece she was trying to ruin. 6 weeks after that will reading, after Mr. Okonkwo had been forced to pause the distribution of the estate pending what Vivian loudly called an investigation, after two of my cousins stopped answering my calls, after my own mother asked me in a small, frightened voice whether there was any chance the accusation was true, Vivian organized what she framed as a family reconciliation dinner at my grandmother's house, the house she still occupied, and invited the entire extended family plus my grandmother's two surviving oldest friends, Delia and a man named Harold, who had known the family for 50 years. Those 6 weeks had been their own kind of education. I watched a family I'd belonged to my whole life reorganize itself around a lie with unsettling speed, watched group chats I'd been part of for years go silent the moment I appeared in them, watched relatives who'd eaten at my table cross the street rather than have the conversation. A cousin's wife unfriended me on every platform at once, a small cruelty that stung more than it should have. An aunt by marriage sent me a long message about how disappointed my grandmother would have been, never once considering that she was taking the word of the one person who actually had something to hide. I could have ended it in a day, of course, could have played the recordings the morning after the will reading, but I hadn't. And the reason I hadn't was something I only fully understood later, that I wanted the truth to come out in front of everyone at once, in the same kind of room where Vivian had tried to bury me, because a quiet vindication delivered to a lawyer's office would never undo a public accusation delivered to a crowd. So I waited, and I let Vivian believe she was winning, and I let her build her reconciliation dinner, because I understood by then that she would not be able to resist staging exactly the kind of public spectacle that would give the truth its widest possible audience. She presented it as a chance to clear the air, but I understood the moment I walked in and saw the seating she'd arranged, with a single empty chair positioned at the head of the table like a defendant's box, that this was not reconciliation. It was a trial with a nicer tablecloth. She had printed folders again, the way people like Vivian always have folders, and she distributed them around the table with the air of a prosecutor. Bank statements with certain lines highlighted in yellow, a timeline of my visits to the house, a summary she'd typed up herself of what she called the pattern of my behavior. I watched her hand them out and thought about how much work this had taken, how many hours she'd spent building the case, and how a person who put this much effort into destroying someone had clearly decided long ago that I was expendable, that I had always been expendable, that my only value to her was as a place to set down a crime when she needed one. She had even arranged the food to serve her performance, a formal dinner with my grandmother's good china, as if the ceremony of it would lend weight to her accusations, as if a person could not lie across a beautifully set table. My mother sat halfway down the table with her hands in her lap and would not quite meet my eyes. And I understood she was frightened, caught between a sister who had dominated her whole life and a daughter she wanted to believe. And I did not hold it against her because I had spent my own childhood learning exactly how heavy Vivian's disapproval could feel. She stood at the head of that table in my grandmother's dining room, under the chandelier my grandfather had installed the year they married, and she told the assembled family that she'd brought everyone together so that I could either confess and return the money or be cut out of this family for good. And she said it looking at me with an expression of such tender sorrow that I understood, finally and completely, that she believed her own performance, or had performed it so long she no longer knew the difference. Right at the peak of it, while Vivian was walking my Uncle Ray through the highlighted bank statements line by line, my phone buzzed in my bag, and it was a call I'd been waiting on for 3 days, from a hospital in the next state where my father, long divorced from my mother and mostly absent from my life, had been admitted after a fall. And where I was, it turned out, the only family member he'd listed as an emergency contact. I stepped out onto the back porch to take it, the same porch where my grandmother used to shell peas into a metal bowl on summer evenings. And for 6 minutes, the folders and the highlighted lines meant nothing at all. There was only a nurse's careful voice explaining that my father had asked for me specifically, that he wanted to see me before a surgery scheduled for the following week, that he'd said there were things he needed to say while he still could. I stood out there in the cold with the phone pressed to my ear and felt the strange vertigo of being accused of theft by one part of my family, while another part of it, a part I'd nearly written off, reached for me across years of silence. My husband Ben had come with me and followed me out onto the porch, and he didn't try to solve anything. He just stood close and let me feel whatever I was feeling. He told me something I held on to, that his own father had been forced out of a family business by a brother who spread a similar kind of lie, and had spent the rest of his life smaller because of it, always braced for the next accusation, and that Ben had promised himself he would never let someone he loved shrink like that. He said the thing Vivian was counting on was that I would react like the old Nora, the overlooked niece who apologized for taking up space, and that the most powerful thing I could do was walk back in as the woman I'd actually become, the one who'd built an entire life with her own 2 hands and owed Vivian nothing, not even a raised voice. I told him about my father asking for me, about the strange arithmetic of one family reaching for me while another cast me out, And Ben said that maybe that was the whole lesson of the year. That family wasn't the people who shared your blood, but the people who showed up. And that I got to decide now which of them were which. My father's nurse came back on the line to say he was resting, and just before she hung up, she added, unprompted, that he'd been telling everyone on the ward about his daughter, that she must be someone special because he lit up whenever he talked about her. And I stood on that cold porch and cried for a moment, quietly, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelm of being wanted by the parent I'd spent my life believing had forgotten me. Then I wiped my face, and I put the phone away, and I walked back inside to finish what Vivian had started. When I walked back into that dining room, I didn't raise my voice. I set my bag down and asked Vivian evenly whether she'd mind if I played something for the family before she continued. And before she could object, my grandmother's oldest friend Delia, the same Delia whose calls Vivian had screened for years, spoke up from her seat and said she thought everyone in this room ought to listen to whatever Nora had, because she, for one, had spent 4 years watching Vivian decide who got to talk to her best friend, and she was done being quiet about it. Vivian's composure flickered for the first time, because Delia was not supposed to be a problem. Delia was supposed to be a frail old woman who nodded along, and instead Delia was sitting up very straight with her hands folded and her chin lifted. I took out my phone and explained calmly that during the last months of my grandmother's life, when she was frightened and often confused, she had asked me to record some of our conversations because she said she wanted a record of her own wishes in her own voice, in case anyone ever tried to speak for her after she was gone. I pressed play on the first recording. My grandmother's voice filled that dining room, thin but clear, and in it she told me she was worried about the money, that Vivian had been moving things and wouldn't explain, that she'd tried to call the accountant herself and found the number had been changed, and that she wanted me to know, if anything ever came up, that she had never given Vivian permission to take anything for herself. The room went very still. I watched the faces around that table, the same faces that had scraped their chairs away from me, begin to do a different kind of math, because there is no mistaking the sound of a frightened old woman telling the truth in her own kitchen, and every person there had known that voice their whole lives. Vivian said too fast that my grandmother had been confused, that you couldn't trust anything she said in those months. And I said that was interesting, because Vivian had spent the last 6 weeks citing my grandmother's trust in her as the reason my alleged theft was so painful. And now that same grandmother was suddenly too confused to be believed. And I asked which was it. Was grandmother a reliable witness to my supposed crimes, or an unreliable one when she spoke against Vivian? Because she could not be both. And Vivian had no answer. Uncle Ray, who had made that struck sound at the will reading, set down the folder Vivian had handed him and folded his hands on top of it. And I saw him look at his sister for the first time that evening the way you look at a stranger. I played the third recording last, and it was the one that ended it because it was not my grandmother's voice at all. It was Vivian's. My grandmother, frightened and clever even in her confusion, had left a small recorder running in her study one afternoon, tucked under a stack of magazines where no one would think to look, and it had captured Vivian on the phone with someone, the accountant as it turned out, instructing him to move a sum from my grandmother's account into one Vivian described as the management account, and telling him, in a voice with no sorrow in it whatsoever, that the old woman would never notice, and the niece could be blamed if it ever came to that because the niece was around and had no money, and no one would question it. Those were nearly her exact words. The niece could be blamed, and they filled that dining room under my grandfather's chandelier, played out of a phone speaker into a silence so complete you could hear the ice settling in someone's abandoned glass. I let it play to the end, all of it. The casual arithmetic of a woman deciding to frame her own niece the way another person might decide what to make for dinner. And I watched the last of Vivian's performance drain out of her face, leaving something underneath it that I had never seen before, which was fear. She reached for the phone as if she might stop it, and Uncle Ray put his hand flat on the table, not touching her, just a clear signal to leave it, and she pulled her hand back. When the recording finished, there was a silence in that room unlike any I have ever sat through. The silence of a dozen people all understanding the same terrible thing at the same moment. Harold, my grandmother's other old friend, who had said nothing all evening, set down his water glass and said, in the quiet, even tone of a man who had seen enough, that he had known this family for 50 years, and he had always wondered how Vivian afforded certain things, and that he supposed now he knew. The table that had arranged itself against me began to come apart in real time. Marcus said, to no one in particular, that he felt sick, that he'd let Vivian turn him against his own cousin over a stack of highlighted papers he'd never once questioned. My mother put her face in her hands. Uncle Ray stood up slowly and walked the length of the table to where I sat and put his heavy hand on my shoulder, and he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he was sorry, that he'd known me since I was born and should have known better, and that he was ashamed it had taken a dead woman's voice to make him see straight. Delia was nodding along with an expression of grim vindication, the look of someone who had been telling the truth for years to people who wouldn't listen and was finally being heard. The room that had scraped its chairs away from me 6 weeks earlier was now, one by one, turning its whole attention on Vivian, and she stood at the head of the table with her folders and her highlighted lines, and understood that the trial she had staged had convicted the wrong person, and the consequences came the way they come when a careful person's carefulness finally fails all at once. Mr. Okonkwo, as executor, was legally obligated to act on the notarized letter and the documented irregularities, and he referred the matter to an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse, and the accountant Vivian had instructed on that recording, facing his own exposure, cooperated fully rather than go down with her. The bank, presented with an official request from the estate's attorney, produced records showing that the $60,000 Vivian had accused me of stealing had in fact moved into an account she controlled, along with a good deal more that no one had known to look for. Sums siphoned steadily over the 4 years she'd lived in that house, managing my grandmother's care. Vivian's name, which had signed every family document for 2 decades, was removed from all authority over the estate by court order, and the reconciliation dinner she'd hosted to cast me out became, in a bitter irony, she surely appreciated the evening that produced the witnesses whose accounts helped build the case against her. The house she'd lived in for 4 years, my grandmother's house, was found to legally belong to the estate rather than to Vivian, and she was required to vacate it once the settlement concluded. The very house from whose head chair she had tried to banish me. A charity board she had sat on for years, one that had given her a certain standing in the community she prized, quietly asked for her resignation once the nature of the case became known, unwilling to keep a member facing allegations of elder financial abuse. The new accountant who had done her bidding surrendered his own license to practice rather than face the full consequences of what the cooperation revealed. Two of my cousins, Marcus among them, called me within the week to apologize. Marcus so ashamed he could barely get the words out, admitting he'd never actually seen any proof. He just believed Vivian because Vivian had always been the one who seemed to know. My grandmother's friend Delia, freed at last from Vivian's screening, told me she intended to say at the memorial everything Vivian had prevented her from saying for 4 years. And my own mother, who had asked me in that small, frightened voice whether the accusation might be true, sat across from me at my kitchen table and wept and apologized for doubting me. And I held her hand and told her that Vivian had fooled smarter people than either of us for longer than we'd been alive, and that being fooled by a practiced liar was not the same as a failure of love. Vivian asked to see me 2 months later, after the lawyers had done their work and the shape of what she was facing had become clear, and I agreed to meet her once, in a coffee shop on neutral ground, mostly because some stubborn part of me wanted to look at her without a folder in her hands. She looked smaller than she had at the head of that table, and she wrapped both hands around a cup she didn't drink from, and she said she was sorry, that it had started small, a few dollars here and there she told herself she was owed for all the care she provided, and that it had grown the way those things grow until she was in too deep to stop, and that when the will reading came and she panicked, blaming me had seemed like the only way out, and she understood if I never forgave her. But she was asking anyway, because we were family, and family was supposed to mean something. She said she hadn't set out to be this person, that no one does, that she'd spent so many years being the responsible one, the one who handled everything, that somewhere along the way she'd started to feel the money was as much hers as anyone's, payment for a life spent managing other people's affairs. I listened to all of it, and I noticed that even now, even in her apology, she was building a case, arranging the facts so that she came out as a woman who'd made understandable mistakes, rather than a woman who'd robbed a dying mother and framed a niece. And I understood that this was simply who she was, that the arranging never stopped, that she would go to her grave organizing the evidence in her own favor. I let her finish. I told her I had spent a long time thinking about what my grandmother would have wanted, on that porch and in the weeks after, and that my grandmother had loved her, had trusted her, and that Vivian had taken that trust and used it to rob a frightened old woman, and then tried to hang the crime on the one person my grandmother had asked for help. "You didn't just steal money, Vivian," I said. "You made my grandmother spend her last clear months afraid in her own house. I can forgive a lot of things, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that one away to make you feel better." She nodded like she'd known that was the answer before she asked, and she left her coffee untouched, and I watched her walk out into the parking lot smaller than I'd ever seen her, and I did not feel triumphant, only tired. And underneath the tired, finally, something that felt like the ground going solid under my feet. The following weekend, I drove to see my father before his surgery. the father I'd nearly written off, and I sat by his hospital bed while he said the things he'd wanted to say, apologies decades overdue. And it was awkward and incomplete, and more than I'd expected to ever get. And when I told him, quietly, about the book, about Elena Frost, about the life I'd built without anyone in the family knowing, he laughed until he coughed and said he'd read that book on a plane last year and cried at the ending, and had no idea his own daughter wrote it. And we sat there together in that strange, happy grief until the nurse made me leave. He asked me, before I left, why I'd kept it secret so long, and I told him the truth, that I'd grown up in a family where good things got taken, and he was quiet for a while. And then he said that he'd been part of the reason I'd learned that lesson, that a father who disappears teaches a child that nothing good is permanent, and that he was sorrier for that than for almost anything. The surgery went well, as it turned out, and in the months that followed, we built something cautious and real out of the wreckage of the years he'd missed. And I found that forgiveness and reckoning could live in the same room after all, that I could hold him accountable for the absence and still be glad, fiercely glad, to have him back. A few weeks after that, once the estate was finally settled and my grandmother's true wishes honored, I gathered the part of the family that remained, my mother and my cousins and Delia and Harold, at a small dinner at my own house. And I told them, because I decided I was done keeping the good things secret out of fear, about the book and the studio deal and all of it. And I watched them be happy for me in a way that Vivian had spent 20 years teaching me to expect would never happen. But the twist, the thing I didn't see coming, arrived at the very end of that dinner, when Delia stayed behind after the others had gone and told me there was one more thing my grandmother had wanted me to have. And she reached into her handbag and produced a small worn envelope, and inside it was a savings bond my grandmother had bought in my name the year I was born and hidden away from Vivian's control for over 30 years, its value grown quietly all that time, along with a note in my grandmother's hand that said she'd always known I was the one who would take care of the truth, and that this was hers to give and no one else's, and that she was sorry she couldn't protect me from Vivian while she was alive, but she'd done what she could to make sure the truth outlived them both. Delia told me my grandmother had given her the envelope 2 years before she died, during one of the rare afternoons Vivian left the house, and had made Delia promise to keep it hidden and to give it to me only after everything had settled, only after the truth had come out, because she'd known, somehow, that it would have to come out the hard way first. I sat there at my own table holding an envelope a dead woman had entrusted to a friend for safekeeping across years of Vivian's screening and control, and I understood that my grandmother had seen all of it coming, had known what Vivian was long before any of the rest of us admitted it, and had spent her last lucid strength not on protecting herself, but on making sure that when the moment came, I would have what I needed to stand. It was not the money that undid me. The amount was modest, next to everything Elena Frost had earned. It was the knowing, the proof that in a house where I'd been made to feel invisible, one person had been watching me clearly the whole time and had loved me enough to plan for a future she wouldn't live to see. I keep that note framed on the wall of the office where I write now, where I write under my own name these days, because I decided I was finished hiding behind Elena Frost, and I look at it on the mornings when the words won't come. I used part of what my grandmother left me to start a small fund in her name, one that helps older people who suspect they are being financially exploited get an independent review of their own accounts. Because the thing that haunts me most about that whole year is not what Vivian did to me. I recovered from that. But what she did to a frightened woman who spent her final clear months unable to get anyone to believe what she could see plainly happening to her own money. My grandmother had to leave recordings and hidden envelopes in a notarized letter, and a friend sworn to secrecy just to be believed after her death. And I decided that if I could spare even one other person that particular helplessness, the money would have done more good than Vivian ever imagined when she was moving it around in the dark. I think about that dining room a lot, the one where a woman I'd been taught to defer to for my entire life tried to convict me under my grandfather's chandelier, and the one where a frightened old woman's careful planning reached out from beyond her own death to protect the granddaughter she couldn't save in life. If you have ever had someone the whole family trusted stand up and tell a room full of people you love that you are a thief, you already know that the deepest wound isn't the accusation. It's watching the faces of the people you love decide, even for a moment, to believe it. So let me ask you something before you go. If someone in your own family did to you what Vivian did to me, and then sat across from you 2 months later and asked for forgiveness because family is supposed to mean something, could you give it, or are there some things family doesn't get a pass for? Tell me in the comments, and if this story was worth your time tonight, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too.